welcome to our first episode of CCBH Chats. CCBH Chats is a new series to discuss mental behavioral health topics, issues, and resources. My name is Stephanie Dayton, and I'm the school-based therapy coordinator with Calvert County Behavioral Health, and I'll be your host today. September is National Suicide Awareness Month. So in this episode, we will be exploring the topic that can be difficult to discuss, suicide and suicide prevention. If at any time during this episode you feel you need to speak to somebody, please contact the Calvert Crisis Response at 1-877-467-5628. Feel free to comment or ask any questions in the comment sections. I would like to introduce Ms. Pam Pierce, the clinical supervisor and therapist at Calvert County Behavioral Health. Thank you, Pam, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me to talk about an important topic.
I'm glad you're here. So what can you tell for viewers who don't know what suicide is? What is it?
Well, it's kind of a simple definition that I think about suicide is that it's somebody who has an intent to kill themselves, and they do so by their own hand. So, sometimes people will die because they've done something, but they didn't mean to die. But suicide is really about intent.
Okay. So it's when you're thinking you just want to end your life.
Absolutely.
So who is at risk for suicide?
Maybe the question should be who's not at risk. Right now in our country, just about everybody's at risk. There's a lot of risk factors that we, can identify with different age groups. I have a few risk factors that I've written down, and as I write them, it seems like the list gets longer and longer. So things, for example, people who have tried to commit suicide prior, people who have family members that have died by suicide, job loss, financial loss, mental health challenges, substance use disorders, maybe cognitive challenges, family loss, grief. I could just go on and on and on. When we think about statistically, there's a statistic that I found that I thought was an interesting thing, that 46% of people who die by suicide have already been diagnosed with a mental health challenge, but 90% of people who die by suicide have at least had symptoms of a mental health problem. So, those are some things that also can cue us in on how to identify people that we might see right in front of us that have symptoms that we should be concerned about.
So almost 50% of our population has had thoughts of suicide.
Yes.
That's a big number.
It's a huge number.
So you hear in the news we have COVID going on. How has that affected people's with mental health and suicide? Have we seen an increase?
We have seen an increase. Unfortunately, COVID has, people had to either self-quarantine or be quarantined because of what their jobs had mandated. There's a lot of isolation that's happened, a lack of important family members being able to be involved. And then when people have other symptoms going on, whether they're mental health, whether they're substance use disorders, whether they're even somatic and physical health problems, people were afraid to access health care, or that even if they didn't have the ability to even do like a virtual telehealth kind of appointment. So then that isolation and some of those fears get even bigger. COVID sent people even into fears of scarcity, of like food scarcity, different, there's been loss of roles with jobs because people aren't actually in their offices, all kinds of things that have really increased. We're watching children, the stress of having to be a full-time caregiver to children because they were at home doing virtual schooling and having to be a teacher and a parent, and that's a lot of pressure that people were not ready for, or not prepped for, I should say.
Do you know how children are being affected?
Children are being affected. I'm one of the therapists in the school-based therapy program, and I work with the younger population who have lots of fear about their parents. One parent is a firefighter, and the child of that father is saying, I'm afraid every day that my father's gonna come across somebody or have to help somebody who has COVID and may be exposed. And then of course that fear comes to him. What if I'm exposed? What if my mom or dad dies? What do I do? So yeah, it's really impacting our students.
COVID's impacted everybody, and it's amazing to see that connection that it goes across the whole board about what COVID is doing with us.
Yes, children all the way up to our senior citizens. Yeah.
So, what are the warning signs of somebody who's having thoughts of suicide?
Warning signs can change from person to person. Oftentimes, some of the behaviors that people already display, for example, impulsivity, that might go up or down. People may become very sort of, reckless in their behavior, doing things that are much more risk-taking. We may see an increase in substance use, emotions that get heightened, serious depression, avoidance, isolation, not communicating with people, going out. Those kinds of things are typically the things that we're looking at directly. Other things that might be good warning signs is then we might see people kind of suffering and really aren't sure, and they maybe had lost somebody, had a family loss, or not know how to talk about it, or not know how to access help for it. Okay. So there's those kinds of risk factors. Breakups from kids all the way up to long-term marriages. Sometimes, people will walk around with things like that, and that may be a warning sign. How's that person doing? People can sometimes act one way, and yet inside they're really suffering and in a lot of pain.
So sometimes it sounds like it's good if you have a close friend or family member that knows you, and that can recognize that there's something different in your demeanor.
That's a very important aspect of suicide prevention, is to have sort of somebody on our team, or I always say, who's in your tribe that you can trust? Because those are the people usually that we are closest with, whether it's a direct family member or a peer or even a work peer. That colleague might see something and be able to even ask you, hey, what's going on?
Good. So it's good to have those close friendships around. So what should I do if I know somebody who's thinking about suicide? What should I do?
Well, I would ask you, how do you know that they're thinking about suicide? That would be one of the first things. Have you asked them?
No.
Mm-hmm. So my first thing is that we can take away some of the fear about asking a person if they are thinking about suicide. It may be that this person has shown you some symptom. What have they shown you that makes you understand or believe that they're thinking about dying?
But they're just staying home all the time. They never want to go out. They've even made comments that they wish they just weren't on this earth, and that everything would be better without them.
So those things might be a really good place to start by saying, hey, look, I'm really missing you. You're not coming out with us, or you're not talking with me, and I've really noticed that, when we do talk, you're saying things like, I don't want to be here, or maybe things would be better off if I'm not here. I'm worried about you. What's happening? And then if the person says, nothing, I'm good, no problems, maybe ask again. But I have really noticed you. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you really down in the dumps? I'm here for you. and offer yourself as a friend and a support person.
So I've heard that if I ask somebody if they're thinking about suicide, that I'm going to put that thought in their head. Is that true?
That's a question, everybody asks that question and thinks that question, but it's a big myth. It really is. By just asking the question simply does not put the thought of suicide in somebody's head. At a training that I was at, one of the examples that was given that I thought was really powerful, the facilitator said, think of something or somebody that's really important to you. And I thought of my cat because she was really important to me and something I cherish. And then the facilitator turned around and said, give me your cat. And so she said, was my asking you to give me your most prized possession or something that you value or cherish? Does that put you, in a position that you're going to be thinking about giving me that cat? Well, probably not. Probably not. So it's the same kind of principle with suicide. Asking does not put the idea in somebody's head.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's kind of, because our life is very precious. And people who are considering suicide are really battling inside of their heads and their heart up until, the time that they die. And that's the thing where intervention can be so important, because if there's any question that person has, even if they have a strong feeling of wanting to die and a really good plan and a strong intention, they're still battling. Inside they are still battling. And so for somebody to ask the question very directly can say, hey, maybe somebody really does need her, and this doesn't have to be the end.
So I guess asking the question is better than just ignoring it.
Absolutely. When we ignore the question, I often say, people have a lot of fear about talking about death and about suicide. There's a lot of stigma that still exists around suicide, when actually asking a person or talking about it openly is going to be the thing that really takes that stigma out of telling somebody about your feelings, what's going on in your life.
I agree. I feel like being open is more positive than just shutting in.
Right.
Now, I know there's a lot of teenagers. We're online a lot. We talk to our friends through text messages, or we play games online with our friends and we're chatting. So, and I notice they're acting differently. How could I go about and ask them if they're having thoughts of suicide? What's different than being in person than being virtually?
Well, you can ask somebody virtually if they have thoughts of suicide. Being physically with the person, it's a lot easier sometimes than to say, hey, I'm here for you, and to make that kind of a contact with somebody. However, when you're virtual, there's always a chat option on games and social media where you can do a little private kind of snippet. The other thing is that if somebody is really struggling and you pick that up on a game that you're playing or on some kind of social media, then it may be that while you're talking or playing the game, you have somebody go and check on the person, or make a phone call to the person, or just do a wellness check, It can be that maybe a parent is called or a friend is called.
What is a wellness check?
A wellness check is basically, I think about a wellness check first, that we used to always think of calling our police officers who still do wellness checks. So if I had a real concern about, say, you, Stephanie, we live in different counties, and I might call a police officer and say, hey, can you just ride by and check on my friend? I have concerns about her. And they don't go in with, or like the SWAT team. It's just sort of like, hey, how are things going? Is everything okay? And we were called because somebody cares about you, and they want to check on your well-being. So it's just simply that, checking in with the person, seeing how they're doing, maybe even asking some questions as well. Somebody has a sense that you may be struggling, and have thoughts of suicide, and to do some intervention at that point in time.
Okay, so a wellness check is, it could be a police officer, it could be a firefighter, it could be a family member or just another friend
Absolutely.
to check on me.
Yeah.
Now, there's times when I have heard people kind of jokingly say they just want to die, or they just joke around and say, oh, I just can't do it, I can't live anymore. Or do you think they're just looking for attention?
I don't know. How do we find things out? We ask the question, right? And so it's really important that every time anybody, whether it is a very young child or a very old elderly person, that we ask them and we take that message that they're saying, you know, I want to die or I can't take it anymore, that we take that seriously and take a minute to really just ask some questions, talk about it, maybe even give some resources, find out, explore a little bit what's going on. Because the bottom line is that when somebody verbalizes that they don't want to be here anymore, whether it's in a passing or a joking way, that does not mean that they're really joking or looking for attention.
Okay. Now, say I was talking to you and I told you all this information about what's going on in my life, and it's just very dreadful, and I mentioned that I've thought about killing myself, and I don't want you to tell anybody. Would you keep that? Would you keep that secret for me?
I can help you talk to somebody else about it to get some help. And then if there is some refusing about that, then I can't keep a promise. I mean, I can't say that I'm going to promise that I'm going to keep a secret if you tell me that you're going to act on your suicidal thoughts.
Okay, so we should, if we really think somebody's going to harm themselves and kill themselves, then we need to speak up.
It's our responsibility for life, basically, to say, you know, hey, somebody's struggling. And to give it, if we cannot address it with that person and get them to the next level of help, it's really important for us to tell somebody else that can help get that person to another level of help.
Now, what if I think they're going to be really angry at me?
So I would probably turn that around and say, am I angry at you because you told me and you shared some of those most intimate thoughts that you're having and the struggle that you're having? Because I wouldn't be angry. And so most people are more willing to have you living than to have you die. So they're not going to be angry if you would share with them. They're going to be concerned and afraid probably and wanting to do the right thing.
So I should just not even think about if they're angry or what's going to happen in the aftermath. Just think that I'm helping them stay alive and knowing that they'll be in my life if they choose to or not.
Right. You know, there's an interesting term that, you know, often my parents would say it, other parents say it, you know, sometimes I'm your parent, I'm not your friend. And even though we're friends with people who may share with us about suicide, there's a part of us that has to take that other role of almost authority to say, okay, I've got to do this to help my person.
So, what are some resources that are out there if I need help?
Well, there's a lot of resources, both nationally and also locally. We have resources for people. I mean, I can read off some of them with some numbers. We have up here our Calvert Crisis Response Team that can come out and help with somebody who has some suicidal thoughts or intention. And the phone number is here at 1-877-467-5628. There's also a national suicide hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK or 8255. There's also something, you know, I wanted to put out. There's a number for the national hotline for TTY if there's hearing impairment or loss at 1-800-799-4TTY or 4899. There's resources for people who have survived suicide or are survivors of somebody who has died by suicide. There's a site called Healing Conversations that offers a number that you can call and just have conversations with people who are absolutely able to support people who have survived a death of somebody they love.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there's resources out there for anybody. Now, what if I have a friend or family member, somebody that I truly love in my heart, and they're showing me all these symptoms and warning signs that they're thinking about suicide, but they just won't talk.
Mm-hmm.
What could I do?
They won't talk to you?
They won't talk to anybody, but you notice these things. You ask them, and you just don't fully feel in your gut that they're being truthful.
Mm-hmm.
What should I do?
Sometimes asking a person if they would be willing to talk to somebody that's not you, or their parent, or their spouse, or whomever it may be. Sometimes that's a way to go about it, because most of the time people, when they're thinking about suicide, there's a lot of shame and guilt about, I'm a burden to my family and I don't want to do this, I don't want to give them my problems and, kind of weigh them down with things. But talking to somebody outside of the family or the direct close friends, sometimes that can actually feel a little safer for people. And as a friend, you could offer to help them do that, and maybe even contact the resources and walk them through the process. Maybe you could even go with them the first time, at least get them. Our director, Doris McDonald, always calls it a warm handoff, to do that sort of like, here's this person that, I talked to you on the phone about, and they're really important to me. I want to be part of their support system.
Now, what if they're not even willing to do that? Would it be wrong to just kind of give them the phone numbers and let them decide what they want to do with, like, say, the Lifeline or Calvert Crisis Response?
Mm-hmm. That would be your personal choice at that point in time. However, if it was my friend, I would find a way probably to call an ambulance or to call a professional who could then come in and do another level of assessment on them, so that I could be sure. And talking to that person about how important it is that they are safe and that I can't leave until I know that they're safe.
Now, who would be a professional for your friend or somebody to talk to if they're having those thoughts of suicide?
So, at Calvert County Behavioral Health, we have licensed therapists who are all trained in some suicide prevention and could absolutely talk to any of them. There's also guidance counselors. Some people feel really comfortable with their clergy at their churches. There are I know that some training that was done at one of our local churches, there were probably 20 people that got trained in how to respond when there's a suicide, a person who is wanting to suicide or is having thoughts about suicide. So clergy and some of those support systems are helpful. A local doctor, primary care doctor, is going to be able to help. Guidance counselors, teachers, those types of people are usually have some training that at least can help you get to the next level if that's necessary.
Okay. Now, how would I know, say I have a young child, or I have a grandparent, or I know somebody who's a senior citizen and they have cognitive difficulties, or they're not able to speak. What would be some signs that I may notice, or how could I help them?
So when we think about our population, whether young, old, with cognitive difficulty, maybe even some dementia, things like that. I mean, the warning signs are still going to be very similar. People will start to withdraw from things that they typically like to do. They may act in ways, exaggerate certain things that they had been doing, those type of things. I think what's really important when you talk about young children and you talk about people who have dementia or who are older, is being able to make sure that that person with some cognitive difficulty or a child, that you talk to them in a way that they understand it. Little children may not know what the word suicide really means. And so talking to them about, well, what is driving this? Has anything happened? And to kind of get down there with the child to help them understand what their comments mean. And the same goes with somebody who may have a cognitive impairment, is to talk about things in a way that they can understand. If the person can't communicate verbally, maybe even doing some pictures. There's ways to do that. If the person's able to read, you could write things and maybe communicate in that way with them. The important thing is that whoever it is that you're working with, they can feel that you really care.
Okay.
And taking the time to sort of meet them where they're at is the important piece.
So it sounds like listening is a
huge.
big part.
Huge.
Now, I know there's times when people are afraid to say suicide. Suicide is a scary word. And people will often say they're thinking about, are you thinking of hurting yourself? Is that appropriate? Can I say that?
Well, you can say that, but think about what that really means. If I'm going to be thinking about hurting myself, it may mean that I'm going to cut myself, but not do anything other. And if your concern is that the person has thoughts of dying, then it would be really important to use the correct words. And it may not be that you use suicide. It may be that you say, are you thinking about killing yourself? Or do you want to die? Those kinds of things, because when we talk about hurting ourselves, there are a lot of ways that people can hurt themselves without an intention to die.
So it's better to kind of be very direct.
Very direct. Absolutely.
Okay. Now, being that it is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, what is something that we can do to help raise awareness?
Talk about it openly, number one. Using things about, like using, in the schools, even using pictures or posters that talk a little bit about suicide. Things like chats, so we can help at least bring the topic to life. I'm thinking there are a lot of things that we can do to raise awareness. Even some people have done fundraisers, virtual fundraisers for suicide prevention. They've done chats for suicide prevention, all kinds of things like that.
Now we have a question from our viewers, and they're wondering, is it possible to predict somebody who is thinking about suicide?
So I guess I can interpret that question like predict if they are going to be a person who may think about suicide, or predict that it's going to happen now. When I think about that, predicting if somebody may contemplate, I don't think that we have a hard and fast rule that can say somebody can be predicted to think about suicide, because we can't predict the future, and people often come into different risk factors over the course of their life. Now, there are some risks that are higher when we think about people who, here's statistics about people who have mental health diagnoses, people who have experienced somebody else who has committed suicide, a close relative. Oftentimes those are predictors that they may be more at risk if the situation or the experience would create the scenario for them to start having the thoughts. But to outright predict who would commit suicide is a little bit difficult. We have other questions coming in.
Yeah, so we do. What some of the common signs that someone is thinking about suicide? I believe we touched on it briefly about those warning signs where you may see somebody that you mentioned that they were withdrawn, that they may sometimes be happy, who's usually really sad.
Right. Or overly happy for no particular reason, overly sad for something that may not even be that sad. So things that we see, behaviors, thoughts, feelings that kind of become more excessive or less, withdrawal. People talk, sometimes throw hints down. Sometimes we see things like an A student starts to just really give up and not even attend to their schoolwork at all, or people missing a lot of work, or performance declining, kind of blowing off things that they typically like to do, like a Friday night gathering at somebody's house. There can be all kinds of things. It's hard to say, because this person is acting in this way, they must be thinking about suicide, unless you're a mind reader, right? And there I go back to that same kind of important message about just being very upfront and honest about it with a person and asking the question if you feel those concerns are big enough that you've really noticed, and to let the person know, I've noticed this about you, and that's really unusual, and so I'm worried about you, what's happening, and then to ask the question if it feels appropriate, if they're considering suicide.
Now, would a sign be that, say, somebody's giving away their possessions? Would that be a sign of somebody thinking about suicide?
Very good point, Stephanie. We do see some of that at times. It's not everybody who wants to attempt or has a plan to die gives away their possessions. However, it is a reasonably common thing. They start to get rid of those things. Sometimes it may be like if a necklace is really important to me and I know that you like it, I might give it to you just like, oh no, I just wanted you to have it. I know how much you like it. And then we see them, I'm a football player and I have a lucky football. Here's my lucky football. I want you to have this. Well, those are things I probably wouldn't give away.
Now, maybe I have asked somebody if they're having thoughts of suicide, and they say yes, I've connected them to resources, and they still die. Is it my fault? Is there something else I could have done differently?
So it's never your thought, and that's always a risk. However, knowing that you took the action and the responsibility to show your care and concern is really important, and that you gave them options and choices. Ultimately, when somebody takes their own life, that's their decision, and we can't always stop. Our job as friends and community members is to try to interrupt and give that person another day to live and another day to contemplate and to find something that might change. Something we say to people often in a therapeutic setting is that remember, feelings change, thoughts change, and when we interrupt somebody's process that they're already putting into motion, it gives them another chance. And that's what our job is, as people in general, is to give somebody else another chance. And unfortunately, sometimes people do end up dying by suicide anyway. And you did. If you talked to them about it, you listened to them, you told them how much you cared about them, you walked them through, got them to the next level, got some help and assistance, there's not anything else you could have done. So it wouldn't be your fault. It wouldn't be your fault.
That's important to know.
Yeah. I mean, how would you feel feel if you have the thoughts of, gosh, I know that my friend is really struggling over there and I'm really worried because that's the kind of friend that might really take their life one day, but I couldn't say anything because she might really be embarrassed or hurt. And then you find out the next day that she died by suicide. I mean, that would be devastating. So to know that you did everything you could would be the part of that you could use to help comfort and heal.
Well, Pam, I want to thank you for all the time. You gave us a lot of valuable information about suicide and how we can prevent suicide. Is there any important topics, any important takeaways that we should know or remember from our discussion today?
There is an acronym that we've kind of gone over, and it's sort of an acronym from some prevention training that we've done called TALK, and it's really about talk, ask the questions to your friends and family, listen to what they have to say back, and then keep them safe until you can get them to the next level of health. I mean, those are really the important pieces. And that, and I say to people that it's not your responsibility to do it all. If you can talk, ask, listen, and then keep them safe, you've done a lot. And then you can let the person go into somebody else's arms and care and compassion to do the next piece if there's other work that they need to do.
So that's a really easy acronym.
Yeah.
So talk would be more talking with the person.
Absolutely.
Asking them, are they thinking about suicide? And just listening to what the response and what's happening, and then connecting them with somebody.
Right, which keeps them safe ultimately.
Now we have one more question from our viewers, and they were wondering, can the risk for suicide be inherited?
Inherited is a strong word. However, there is a lot of research that's going on right now about suicide. In fact, I'm trying to think if it is Hopkins that's doing big research, has some statistics mapped out that if you have a first direct, what's the word I want, line of connection with somebody. So it's say if my mother and my grandmother, if my grandmother died by suicide, then my risk apparently increases. Now, just because there's some genetic findings about that does not mean that if somebody's mom, dad, brother, sister, whomever has died by suicide, it does not mean that that person is destined to die by suicide. So there's some research that's going on that's very telling, while at the same time, it's sort of like substance use. If you have a parent or brother or sister who has a substance abuse issue or a mental health diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will too. And those are the things. So awareness, understanding about, back in earlier on when we were talking, you were saying how important it is to have that social connection with people who care and love you and that know you. I mean, you can even use that if you know something about yourself. You can say, wow, it's really important. I've had some people in my family who have died by suicide, so it's really important for me to have those connections. And you can start to prevent things from happening in the future.
So it's not necessarily that it's going to happen if your mother or grandmother died by suicide. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind and know that you may be at an increased risk.
Increased risk, yes. Yeah.
So again, I really want to thank you for your time today.
I appreciate that you've taken the time and the interest in trying to get this out to people.
And we also want to thank Laura Silverman, who has helped make everything go happen today on our first CCBH Chats episode. And we hope that you stay tuned and keep a lookout for our next episode next month in October as we discuss domestic violence. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.